Right. Okay. Yes. Welcome to this safe space. As there are external people on the call, there's a note here that says that paranormal data science is not officially supported research group at the OII. Seem to have missed the word "yet" out of that sentence. But, so yes, welcome to an exploration of the power we have against extra-dimensional beings that might be incurring on our world. So I'd say I've got quite a lot here. This you'll see my affiliations here. I am a senior research fellow here at the OII. I'm also here representing a blog that I run called WeirdDataScience.net, which means that if you're interested in any of the things that you see here, well, for a start, you can contact me because you're all here. But secondly, you can go to the blog where you will find far more detail, far more maths, far more code, and you can contact me if you want. If you want to submit an article, then let me know. Right, so to begin with, we're talking about aliens, UFOs. And people tend to think of the sort of 1950s, 1960s craze. But throughout history, humanity has been subject to these strange manifestations from the skies. If you read old historical documents, you'll hear about aerial phenomena, you'll hear about angelic beings coming down from the sky, humans carried off in fiery chariots, if you read your Ezekiel from the Bible. Going back to 27 to 29 BCE, Louis ab Urbe Condita recorded portents when he wrote about the year 218 BCE, where he said, and I quote, "Nauium speciem de cale ad fulcisse." If you criticize my Latin, then I expect better of you. But phantom ships had been seen gleaming in the sky. And looking again to Plutarch's Lucullus, sort of recording an event that happened between two armies on a battlefield. On a sudden, the sky opened and a large luminous body fell down in the midst between the armies, in shape like a hogshead, but in color like melted silver. This wonderful prodigy happened in Phrygia. So, throughout history, we have these strange events, these strange craft coming down from the sky. If we look forward to Nuremberg in 1561, reported in a precursor to a newspaper, a broadsheet of that era. This is actually the illustration that accompanied this news report of the time. At first, there appeared in the middle of the sun two blood-red semicircular arcs, just like the moon in its last quarter. And in the sun, above and below, and on both sides, the color was blood. There stood a round ball of partly dull, partly black ferrous color. Likewise, there stood on both sides and as a torus about the sun, such blood-red ones and other balls in large number, about 3 in a line and 4 in a square, also some alone. There is more. I couldn't put more on the slide, but this is a wonderful thing for you to look at. And 5 years later in Basel in Switzerland, it happened in 1566 3 times, on 27th and 28th of July, and on August the 7th, against the sunrise and sunset, we saw strange shapes in the sky above Basel. At the dawn of August 7, we saw large black spheres coming and going with great speed and precipitation before the sun, and chattered as if they led a fight. Many of them were fiery red and soon crumbled and then extinguished. This is an in detail report of an aerial battle that happened, seen by many, many people above Basel in 1566. But then we move forward to what we might consider the modern era of the UFO phenomenon, or as it's more often reported in scientific studies nowadays, the UAP, the unidentified aerial phenomena, rather than unidentified flying objects. But in Washington, DC in 1952, witnessed by many, many people, and again, this is a cartoon from a published article of the day about flying saucers seen over Washington, DC in 1952. 7 flying objects that showed up on radar, moved rapidly over Washington, DC. It was observed by pilots. They reported it as white tailless, fast-moving lights. And one of the quotes was that their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft. It could not be explained by the technology of the time. The UK is no stranger to UFO sightings. In fact, one of the most well-documented UFO sightings in history occurred in Rendlesham Forest in 1980, December 1980, close to RAF Woodbridge, which is a UK Air Force base, but a base that was being used by the US Air Force. And the quote here is that servicemen initially thought it was a downed aircraft, but upon entering the forest to investigate, they saw what they described as a glowing object, metallic in appearance with coloured lights. The Ministry of Defence had a particular consultant who looked into a number of UFO sightings, but their quote about this particular incident is that the event posed no threat to national security, and therefore it was never investigated as a security matter. So, a cover-up. And of course, potentially the most famous UFO case, UFO sighting in history, in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. There was a reported crash and the recovery of debris from a flying saucer on a ranch near Corona, New Mexico. It was reported to the local sheriff's office, along with some debris that was recovered, and a particular individual from the Roswell Army Airfield base nearby came and gathered some more wreckage. This was initially claimed to be a weather balloon of the era. And then in 1994, the US government said that this was actually a high altitude surveillance balloon as part of US Project Mogul that was using high altitude balloon to detect nuclear testing in the Soviet Union. However, some of the people were involved with this, some of the people that discovered the wreckage later claimed that the materials were like nothing made on this earth. And this was associated with a particular craze in 1947 of over 800 related sightings. So a little bit of history of the phenomenon we're studying. And the US government took this somewhat seriously. They set up an organization led by an astronomer called J. Allen Hynek, who performed a systematic study of UFO phenomena starting in 1952, and the project continued until 1969. Their main remit was to look at the security implications. Was this a threat to the national security of the United States? And eventually, around sort of 1969, there was a report in 1968 called the Condon Report that drew on both the data that had been gathered by Project Blue Book and civilian studies, civilian data gathering, that concluded that the study of UFOs was unlikely to result in significant scientific discoveries. Fools. Okay, but this is a graph from one of the reports submitted by Project Blue Book around 1952, around the time of the Washington DC sightings. Back in the day when drawing a graph meant sitting there with a pen and paper and a list of numbers, and this is wonderful. However, one thing that was largely true, and one thing I'm going to argue for you now, and one thing I'm going to propose for you now, is that what I've just given you are what we might call small n studies, qualitative studies. We're looking at one incident. We're going to look deep. We're going to look deeply into this particular case, but we're not going to look very wide. Okay, so narrow and deep research rather than wide and shallow research. Blue Book looked into the trends a little bit, but despite the fear we might feel looking into these data sets, we've got statistics, we've got big data, we've got computers, we've got decades of research into this, decades of data, and we can do something about it. And that's what I'm here to propose today. So there are a number of what we might now call citizen science projects that have been gathering UFO data going back to the 1950s. There is mainly archival now, but there's the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP. Not only useful as an archive of UFO data, but if you want to remember what websites used to look like in 1990, then, or 1994, let's say, then go to their webpage. One of the largest ones is the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, and then there's also the National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC. For the work that I'm going to present here today, we're going to rely on NUFORC data because it's the easiest to scrape. I have contacted MUFON to ask for to access to their database, but they haven't replied. So if you're watching MUFON, then get in touch. Okay. So I'm not going to go into the details of the code. I'm not going to go into the details of how I got this data right now. But let's say I've got the data. Like I say, the code for how I scrape this is available on a blog, or you can email me and I'll talk you through it. But no matter how terrifying or horrifying the data we're looking at, one of the things we want to do is to visualize it, to take a first look, to get a feel, a terror for the data set that we're looking at, for the world that we're plunging into. So let's do some of that. Let's ask some questions. What is happening? What kind of shadow are these alien beings casting over our world? When we can consider it geographically, are sightings independent of geography? Do they occur randomly in various places? Or are there implications about where these events are being located? And also, in the world that we are sort of living in right now, we're all carrying personal surveillance devices at all times. And one of the things you will hear quoted is, isn't it funny how UFO sightings have decreased just as people have got camera phones? Well, let's see if that's true. So here you go. As a first look, this is just purely overall time, a world map showing UFO sightings from the New Thought database. Okay, so we can see, we can be realistic. We can be realistic. Biased towards South America. Of course, okay, it's a US-based organization. They accept reports from around the world, but we can see a very, very heavy sort of bias towards the United States. There are clusters of sightings. The UK is not badly represented here, but across the world. But there's a strong bias. So the aliens are clearly more interested in the United States than in the rest of the world. But this is a very, very crude way of visualizing that. If we want to zoom in and look at the sightings in more detail, we can do something slightly more informative and perform what's called a kernel density estimation on this, where we identify heat maps not just by looking at sightings, but by sort of correlating sightings spatially together. And if we look at the United States, then we can see hotspots of UFO sightings. And what you can see on these little white dots are the locations gathered from the US government catalog of them, of US Air Force installations at the moment, okay? And this little red dot that you can see in the bottom left is Roswell, so, we're only looking at the data. We're not doing a proper statistical analysis, but you might say, there's some association here between US Air Force bases and UFO sightings. So clearly, the aliens are more interested in US air bases than they are in general members of the population. And again, I don't want to ignore the UK. This is reported UFO sightings in the UK. And this map I find quite interesting because one of the standard criticisms of this kind of work is that it's just effectively a population map. There are more people in an area, you get more UFO sightings. Of course, we've got London represented here, but this area on the sort of east coast there, this is the most significant hotspot in the UK, and this is not a heavily populated area. It is the location of Rendlesham Forest, where there was one of the most significant sightings in history. But we can see here, it's spread across the United Kingdom. We do get sightings in various places, and it's not just a population map. It's not just a proxy for population. And finally, to address this question of smartphone usage, this was actually something that I was challenged on Twitter. You never challenged me on Twitter. I was challenged on Twitter. This case, why is it that these UFO sightings have dropped off since we've had smartphones? And in a frenzied 2 hours of I'm going to get this guy on Twitter, I produced this very, very simple graph. This is a normalized trend of adoption of cell phones against population. So you can see the blue line at the top is the population, the general population of the world increasing. The green line is the line of UFO sightings over time. And you can see this yellow line is the rise of the smartphone. And what we can see is that, if anything, the rise of the smartphone is correlated with an increase in UFO sightings. So I was right, they were wrong. That's what statistics is for. Okay, so again, we're doing very descriptive statistics here. We're not performing inference, we're not sort of going further. But one of the things that I found particularly interesting is over time, we tend to think of UFOs as flying saucers. That's your natural image. If I say to you a UFO, you're going to think of a silvery disc. But throughout history, there have been a wide variety of shapes and sizes of UFOs and numbers. They don't just appear singly, they come in clusters or in groups. Plutarch's report that I mentioned in the first slide was of a silvery pithos or a wine jar, your classic amphora type shape. that was one of the first recorded sightings we've got, a silvery wine jar that appeared between two armies and caused both armies to flee the battlefield. The flying saucer we're all familiar with, and beyond. What else is there out there? So one question we might ask is, are the aliens evolving? You know, are they changing their designs? Are they responding to things occurring on Earth? And luckily for us, the National UFO Reporting Center logs the shape of the sighting alongside every sighting it logs. So, and if we split these down over time, now this is across all time, across all periods, you can see like the most widely reported UFO shape is just a light in the sky. That's what people are reporting. Obviously, there's a big other category that might be acceptable. But a circle is there as well, you know, up at the top, and triangles are very widely reported as a UFO shape. And if we look at this as it evolves over time, what we can see is, you know, this is just, you know, representing a small number of sightings here, a large number of sightings there, is that over time, as the numbers go up, we see new shapes emerging in this. So if we normalize this, if we just look at the proportion of sightings per year, we get a graph that looks like this. And what I find particularly interesting is the rise from about the 1950s onwards of the triangular shaped UFO sightings. So this was about the same time that the US military in particular, but other air forces, developed the Delta Wing airplane, you know, triangular shaped aircraft. And so in order to hide amongst us, the aliens are clearly adopting the shapes of the aircraft that they see around them. You know, this is insidious. So, like I said, excuse me. These descriptive statistics, looking just at, you know, the things that we've seen without performing any real inference, can only take us so far as we sort of follow this particular path. And what we're interested really in, and what a lot of people will think of as statistics, if you just say statistics, is inferential statistics. We want to go further. We want to make new predictions. We want to determine new things. There are two major schools of inferential statistics. There's what is sometimes referred to as frequentist statistics. There are many names for them. And these have been very popular in the last century. So if you're a largely sort of not statistically minded person watching this, then, and if somebody says statistics, then the statistics you're used to seeing in newspaper articles or scientific articles will be frequentist statistics. But the alternative are Bayesian statistics, which are an increasingly popular alternative. They've been enabled by the rise of computation because they require computational power. This is where the lecture gets less fun, because I'm going to start talking about maths rather than UFOs. But okay, so what's the basis of Bayesian statistics? You know, I've said this lecture is Bayes versus the invaders, and we're going to take a Bayesian analysis approach here. What are the fundamentals of what sets Bayesian statistics aside from other forms? Well, probably at the core of it, although I'll highlight that this is just a result from probability, is an approach to data analysis that relies on a theorem discovered by the Reverend Thomas Bayes, published posthumously, which allows us to update our beliefs based on data that we observe. So if we see this equation here, this is the core of, like I say, Bayesian statistics, but you can't do statistics without, in some sense, referring to this equation implicitly. What it basically says is, if we want to understand the probability of a particular hypothesis is expressed mathematically, given some data, given the data written here, then we can do that by looking at the probability that the data occurred given our hypothesis, taken as what we call a prior, given the probability of the the likelihood, given the probability of the data, so of the hypothesis a priori, all over the probability of the data, the evidence in total. I'm not going to go into the deep subtleties of Bayes' theorem here because I don't understand them myself. But briefly speaking, we can say our posterior, the things that we believe after we see the data, are the likelihood, the way that the data was generated by our prior beliefs, multiplied by our prior beliefs about the data, all summed over the evidence, all divided by the marginalized version of the evidence. This is a fundamental result in probability theory. It's nothing unusual or controversial. but it's core to this approach to doing inference. Why would we do this? Why would we take a different approach to statistics when there are, well-established approaches that have been around for many, many years? One of the nice things about Bayesian inference is that it allows you to incorporate new data. The posterior, the belief that you have come to from looking at some data, can be easily updated as new data rolls in. You can take this equation and your posterior becomes your prior as new data comes in, and you can just keep cycling and updating your beliefs. And this is very close. One of the arguments that's made is that this is close to how humans intuitively deal with data. We believe something, we see new data, we change our beliefs somewhat, unless you're on social media. One of the other nice things about Bayesian inference is that you don't just get a point estimate of the thing that you're interested in. If you're interested in how many UFO sightings are likely to happen in the next 5 years, by and large, if you use frequentist statistics, you're likely to come up with a point estimate, a value. Bayesian inference, when it's conducted in a full sense, gives you a probability distribution. It gives you these nice error bars and a full shape of what the likely values could be. This is one of the other advantages. And one of the other things it does is it lends itself to what are called hierarchical models, in which you can split up data into correlated phenomena. One of the classic examples of hierarchical models is if you're investigating children in a school or in a set of schools, you've got multiple categories. You don't just treat all the children together. You have children who are in classes, who are in schools, who are potentially in states or something like that. So, as I said, I'm not going to get into the argument. There are some ongoing fights between these two schools of probability. I'm not a huge fan of the fights themselves. Grant knows more about statistics than I ever will, and so I'm not going to get into an argument with him. He's bigger than I am, right? But what's part of the problem here is that doing this comes with significant computational costs. In order to calculate this bottom term, you have to effectively sum over the probabilities of the data entirely, in its entirety, which is not a task you can do sort of very easily. So it's taken until recently for the computers to be fast enough, for the tools to be fast enough, for the maths to be there for us to do this. The way that we do it now is that there are a number of tools out there, a number of frameworks, programming frameworks. I love this. Computation approaches fit models by arcane explorations of the multidimensional space of hyperparameters. Now, I get carried away with my vocabulary, as I'm sure you can tell. But if you take the word arcane out of this sentence, that is literally the mathematical truth of the situation. So you get to talk about multidimensional hyperparameters with a straight face. And that's a good enough reason to do Bayesian statistics as far as I'm concerned. But for what I'm going to show you, for the work that I've done here, I'm using one of the sort of core, what are called probabilistic programming languages, which is called STAN. I've put a link to the website there. And what this basically lets you do is you write down your statistical model in code, which looks very, very similar to the raw model. Okay, you don't have to write lots of surrounding stuff. You just literally write out the model itself. And this tool will turn it into code that runs and performs all this computation, all this maths for you. So it's a very nice way of doing it. So let's perform some experiments. Let's ask some questions, some inferential questions. How do UFO sightings relate to human populations? To what extent are these sort of hideous beings from beyond the blackness of space interested in humanity? Do they favor one location over another? Are some states in the US more interesting than other states? As human populations grow, as the number of people grow, to what extent are the visitors drawn to these increasing study populations that they can go and see? So I'm going to basically just show you the result of a series of mathematical models, starting from the simple one that you'll be familiar with, the linear regression, to a far more complex version that explores the phenomenon better. So this is what you might do if you wanted to understand the relationship between population and the number of UFO sightings. Okay, we've got the population on the x-axis. We've got the number of sightings on the y-axis, and we just draw a dot for every bit of data we've got here. So here the data we're using is the number of sightings per year for every year from the new fault data. Okay, so we've split that there. And we draw a line through it. You know, we've just done a straight up linear regression through it. And we get a line, okay, it increases, fine, we've learned something. And so we know that if the population goes up, then the number of UFO sightings go up. But the trouble with the linear regression is that it makes a lot of simplistic assumptions about the data. This is how we would represent this model. We would say that the Y value is drawn from a normal distribution based on a mean and a standard deviation. The mean is drawn from an intercept and a slope. This is your Y equals mx plus c if you from sort of basic sort of secondary school maths. We're going to put some, in this case, because we're doing Bayesian statistics, we're going to put some priors. The priors are our previous beliefs. What's the likelihood? What are the things we believe beforehand? You don't need to go into the detail here, but as I said, this is the model that you get from that. But it's a bit unsatisfying in a way, because if you start to look more closely, it's like, yeah, the line goes like that, but there are these kind of almost vertical lines of data going through this. So if we color those by state, you can see, well, there's clear clustering behavior here. There's something more than just what than just sort of raw numbers there. So what we might want to do is, rather than performing a linear regression against all the data, we'll do it per state, okay, with some error bars around it like that. And this is fine. We're seeing different states are doing different things, different slopes. But again, I'm a bit dissatisfied by this. I'll tell you why I'm dissatisfied particularly. If you look at the bottom left, you will see that some of the error bars drop below 0. Some of them believe that there will be negative numbers of UFO sightings. And that's because we've assumed a normal distribution of the data. The normal distribution doesn't care about being positive or negative. It can go off infinitely in either direction. So really what we want is a better data generating. These are drawn not from a normal distribution, but something that better represents counts of events. The standard one you would use is called the Poisson distribution for people that do this kind of stuff for fun. Now, I'm actually going to go one step further than the Poisson distribution, because we're past our half-hour point, and I want to get some talks and some questions. But what we do is, rather than the Poisson distribution, we're going to go straight to what's called a negative binomial distribution, which looks a lot like the Poisson, but it relaxes some of its restrictions. The Poisson distribution requires certain relationships between the parameters. And we can build here a negative binomial model. And we can assess this and see that this fits better. So one of the things we do in Bayesian statistics is we compare all our models to our previous models. So we can show, by looking at the data, looking at the models that we've built, that the Poisson model was better than the linear regression, the negative binomial was better than the Poisson model. But I'm going to go one stage further. I'm going to build one of these hierarchical models. Okay? And what this does is it says, we're not just going to treat the data from each US state individually. We're going to say, let's get a little bit of information from all the states whenever we look at one state. Okay, they influence each other. You're going to learn something. It's not the same model. And so what we do is we build into our model here a correlation matrix that says some states are closer to other states, and we're going to fit them together. And when we put all of that together, we get this much nicer, much better fitting set of lines for the individual states that much better incorporate the values that we see. So we can use this, if we would so wish, to predict the amount that UFO sightings would increase if the population of that state increased. And here we can put, this is lovely. I think it's lovely. This is when you've got your y equals mx plus c on a graph to create a line, you've got the intercept, and then you've got the slope, the amount it changes as the value changes. And so to some extent, this is what we're interested in here. For each state, how do they increase as the population increases? And some of them, we know, particularly California up here, it's very low value. It's very tight value. There's not much error there. So as the Californian population increases, the aliens aren't particularly interested. Okay, California's done. You know, California is old news as far as UFOs are concerned. But Delaware. There's something going on in Delaware.
Divide territory.
This is, yeah, so so we can see, yeah, this gives us values for each of the individuals like that. This is and from this we can tell this. So if we wanted to predict an increase, we can use these values to do it sort of relatively with a relative amount of confidence. So I'm not going to go much further into it than that. I'm not going to go deeper into the maths. I think I've horrified you enough. But what might I do? What might one do going further if you wanted to look at this data? Well, we've got other data sources. We could go and plead with MUFON. We could go and plead with some of the other sources to get access to their data, and that would be very important. I'm very interested in the spatial implications. You know, we've done the state-by-state thing, but the kernel density heat map that I did was very visual. We didn't do much analysis of what was the relative increase as you get closer to an Air Force base. One of the things that's particularly interesting if you look into UFO lore is there is a widely stated claim that the 37th parallel geographically is far more clustered for UFO sightings, and particularly for cattle mutilations. That's your thing. I've never actually checked. I was hoping to check, but I spent so long making the slide look pretty that I didn't get a chance to do the maths for that. So that was good. Also, one of the things that I've done that is very, very bad statistically is that I've treated each year as a separate data point with no relationship to the previous years. Okay, so for each state, I've said, 1945 is effectively completely independent of 1946. We would want to do a proper time series analysis for that. And also, I think going all the way back to what Project Blue Book were doing back in 1952, we now have the tools to do significant change point analysis to say, yes, this slope or this trend looks very different, but is it actually statistically different? So we could do some interesting things there. And the final thing again is causal inference, which is the thing we should always be thinking about, is what causes these shifts. We're looking at populations, we're looking at number of sightings, but we might incorporate things like, does a presidential election change the number of sightings, and can we incorporate that into our models? So future directions, future work, and just some final horrifying conclusions. The real horror was the statistics we learned along the way. The other thing that we can definitely say from this graph is that the increased ability to document sightings has not decreased the number of sightings. They're still going up. They're going up. They're rising very much with smartphones. One of the other things I'd like to say is that the data, the analysis, the visualization, and the interpretation of the data are subject to the prejudices that we carry with us. We want to trust the methods, no matter what horrifying things they tell us. But when you're doing an analysis, any analysis, when you're doing your analysis for your thesis, for your coursework, be aware of your priors. What are the things that you're bringing to this analysis? What are the things you believe beforehand that you are baking into your models without thinking about it? This is one of the big problems we have in society right now. Following Fox Mulder from the X-Files, the truth is out there, but within a certain credible interval. We need to be aware of how uncertain we are about our data, and also avoid Delaware. Just get out. It's not too late. So I'll finish there. Thank you for coming. And we've got plenty of time for questions if people want to. We've got even more time for the public if people want.
Hi, so I did my undergraduate in economics, and my econ professors hated Bayesian models, and they're crazy about causality. How does Bayesian models fit in the context of studying causality?
Circuitry?
You asked me whether they're from Jupiter or Saturn. So, I mean, much of the study from one thing I would like to highlight is that Bayesian approaches and frequentist approaches are sort of rely on philosophical differences between things like, do you consider an unknown value as fixed and true but unknown, or a random variable? Bayesian tends to view anything you can't see as a random variable that can shift. The approaches to causality that I am familiar with are more focused on sort of experimental design of your studies, so, and to that extent, I wouldn't want to, I certainly don't know very much, maybe Grant can answer about causal inference in frequentive statistics, but there's nothing that precludes any kind of statistics from doing any kind of approach. You don't get different answers, you get maybe a probability distribution rather than a point estimate. You maybe don't have to do as much computation to get something. But there's no, one of the sort of fallacies is that when you sort of first hear this split is that, that you're somehow going to get a different mean from a population. You certainly can get different sort of estimates, but it's not going to be fundamentally different. I honestly, the easiest thing to say is I don't really know how to answer your question. It's like they certainly will know how to do the causal models that they're doing with the statistics that they're doing. I certainly know that there's a lot of research going on into causal inference and Bayesian models at the moment. But from my perspective, it's more about the design of the experiment and how you account for the causal factors rather than what you actually put into the model itself. It's a good question. Yeah.
There have been whispers that governments often try to cover up some information regarding, unidentified object sightings. Therefore, how can you justify the validity of your data?
Well, I think this is exactly why we need to do this kind of study. It's like it's easy to hide an event. It's easy to hide, one sort of, you can take Roswell and make it a weather balloon, but hiding something in a population-wide statistical pattern is far more difficult. And so, whilst we might doubt some of our data, and we have to incorporate our uncertainties about it, that this is exactly the thing to combat the government cover-ups is to look at the broad trends, to look at those approaches. So yeah, I think that's yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation. This was a lot of fun. The map that you showed of all the reported sightings was based on off of data from a website that you had gathered. Do you know what kind, like if there was a language barrier to people accessing that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the National UFO Reporting Center from the United States that has been running, they've got data, they've got a contact form. In fact, which something I didn't put into the slides is I've actually created an interactive map of it. So you can, if you go to weirddatascience.net and click on the Global UFO Inquirer, there is a map that shows all of the reports geolocated onto a map, and you can click on them and you can see a little bit of coverage of what's there. But it's very much a US organization, and whilst people can report things from all over the world, that is absolutely explained by that language barrier. So clearly the answer is that we need massive funding to do a global reporting project on this. Yeah,
such a sensational look.
I'll go to the back of my computer. Yeah.
I was wondering if you considered maybe a rate of psychedelics consumption. And I asked seriously.
I took nothing when I was writing.
But it could be an interesting data point.
Absolutely, and this is certainly something. There are endless additional. There's no. In addition to the spatial work, there's no sort of bioclimatic stuff in here. Altitude, forest cover, how, even just the population level stuff can be normalized in this. So, the point of, let me put my serious face on for a second. The point of doing this was to play with the statistics in a really fun way, to learn how to do the visualizations in a nice way, without having to be too concerned, I've got to get this done for my, that next publication or something like that. This is you will, the same as a way if you're learning another language, that you'll get a lot more learning about it if you actually sort of go and talk to somebody, play with the language, have fun with it. The same way you do with anything, you will learn it better if you're playing with it. And so that's the point of this, is I don't have to be too concerned. If somebody says that's statistically invalid, I said, yes, it's UFOs. Oh, sorry, I'm going to Bernie and I'll come. You had your hand up for a bit.
Good brains. Good brains. Social media. No brains. Data. Have you explored? So I noticed Reddit has a UFO subreddit I've started following. Of course. And I'm just wondering the extent to which we might consider, based on what you're saying about, say, how we work against conspiracy theories and so forth, what we should expect in terms of variations if we go to a crowdsourced version of this, and whether things that we've done here can inform an analysis of that crowdsource, either in a sense of priors or just in a, the data is probably going to be garbage and we shouldn't use it.
I mean, there's a couple of things. One of the so yes, I've looked a bit at social media. I mean, obviously, yeah, Twitter analysis is something we all do, but also there's for people that aren't familiar with it, there's a tool called GDELT, which comes out of Google, which does global scraping of news articles in a number of languages with automatic translation of search terms. And I use it for a couple of other projects, looking at the wildlife trade and other things. And yes, I've thrown this at it. So somewhere sitting on a hard drive somewhere, I have, probably a couple of years of every time UFO, alien, flying saucer has been mentioned. And so the comparison between that sort of, I mean, admittedly, that's filtered, that's new, that's sort of long form traditional news reporting as opposed to social media. But again, you could create a structure that allowed you to assess the differences between those, and that would certainly be of interest. So good.
When I was young, we moved to Delaware as a family. And a few years ago, my parents moved to Suffolk. And I'm just wondering, would you draw any causal inferences from that, or?
You're not invited to the pub anymore. Well, I mean, again, causation and correlation. I'd have to choose which way round I wanted to interpret. I think I'd probably have to meet your parents first. Yeah.
Kind of related to the question about psychedelics, another interesting data point you could add with is like media consumption or like creative media or documentaries, depending on your view. I think there could possibly be like if a new alien movie comes out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's easy to see on this, but there really is an X-Files bump for anyone who was fortunate enough to live through that era. But yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised at all. But yeah. Sorry, was there anyone else? Sorry, let's get back to my last slide. Yeah. Oh,
I just think you're such a brilliant teacher, and that's what sort of comes through this, above me and the other fun stuff. And so I can't help but wondering whether you could design a whole course based on weird data.
You've gone one step further than that. As I was writing this, I mean, I honestly think Bayesian statistics is something that is like I say, it's not the answer. There are perfectly valid reasons to do both, but the things that you can do with it, the emerging toolkits for it and its use in that, I think it's something we should be looking at for all of us. I'm very fond of the way that allows the tool. I'm not going to say Bayesian statistics in itself, but the toolkits that we've got now allow you to construct your models in a very natural way. I should say I have never taken a statistics course in my life. And this, I'm a computer scientist, and we weren't taught statistics, and it was only sort of later coming to it. And part of this was me saying, I want to understand what that stuff is doing. I'm going to find out for myself. And yes, absolutely. With data science as a course, well, we can talk about that. We'll talk about that. Yeah. Anyone else? Great. Oh, yeah.
No, I forgot. Immediately.
No, that's absolutely fine.
I got spooked.
I should hire. So then, just let me conclude, and we can disperse in whatever way we want to disperse. But there's more than UFOs out there. So if you want, like I said, I'm pushing my blog here. It hasn't been updated for a couple of years because the pandemic took a hit on various things. But if you're interested in UFO sightings, if you're interested in Bigfoot sightings, if you're interested in locations of stories about demons in the United Kingdom, then that stuff that is there. And like I say, there's a lot of code. There's a lot of sort of talking through the statistics. One of the things I do try and one of the purposes for this is that a lot of people who are very embedded in this stuff forget that they didn't know this stuff at the beginning. And part of the reason for documenting this sort of process for me is to always remind myself that there was a moment where I didn't understand the first thing about what was going on here. And so by keeping it in, for myself, it means that I can maintain my own sort of mindset of what it's like to be learning this stuff. I am not an expert on UFOs, maybe, Bayesian statistics, not so much. So this is, everything that is there. You're welcome to talk to me about it. If you want to use these kinds of tools, not necessarily the new fork data set, but maybe like if you want to use Stan in your sort of thesis work or something like that, I'd be very happy to talk to anyone about that. I do think it's an exciting era that we're living through with the improvement in tools and the methods as well. So and also the data visualization stuff here, a lot of that was just fun. How do we build it? So as I say, I hope you enjoyed it a little bit. There's a serious sort of underpinning to this, but it's also fun. It's also a lot of fun to work on this. So yeah.
Thank you for your generous offer of personal support in getting into this.
Let's reinterpret that.
But could you point out a learning source to get into Bayes?
The very best textbook I have ever read on any subject is Statistical Rethinking by Richard McElreath. I may have pronounced his name wrong, but it is a fantastic book that starts from almost no knowledge at all. It's very well written. He's got a lot of lectures online where he takes you through his course. He's a fantastic teacher. I've never met him. I'm just a huge fan. But I'd say it very sort of advisedly. It is a brilliant textbook. It's a model for, I think, for how textbooks should be written. Also, there's a discourse for Stan. There's a very good manual with lots of examples of how models work. But like I say, if I could recommend you one textbook, I mean, if you want to go in, you get into it, you want to go deep into the sort of weeds of it, then there's a book called Bayesian Data Analysis by Gelman et al. But Richard McElreath's Statistical Rethinking second edition has come out in the last year or so, is brilliant, really good. Okay.
We just give huge rounds of applause.